Hello, good afternoon. I'm Dr. Liliana Casal-Wardle. I'm the Executive Senior Director of Food Safety and Supply Chain Risk Management for TAG, the Atchison Group. I am happy to be here today. Apologies for not being able to join you with all the technical difficulties that we had, but hopefully we can get together this way and discuss the challenging issues that you're all experiencing to navigate the perfect storm of supplier constraints, which I know you're all living and managing. So a little bit of an update. TAG and the Atchison Group have a partnership and we share FSMA-related news on these FSMA Friday meetings, regulation changes and updates and industry trends and top topics that might help you in the managing of food safety risks in your different types of industry. So hopefully this presentation is helpful for all of you. And of course, if you have any questions, you can reach out to me through SafetyChain. Thank you, Jim, for having me here. It is a pleasure to be with you. A little bit of my background. I have at this point more than 25 years in managing food safety throughout the supply chain. I was 18 years with the Hershey Company and 3 years with TAG. And in those capacities, I was able to deal with different areas of the food safety systems management and food safety culture, food supply chain, food safety, food defense, food science, cleaning and sanitation, and other areas, and happy to be with you today. A little bit of a regulatory update. FDA issued a guidance on October 20th on refusal of inspection by a foreign food establishment or foreign government. This is very important because FDA has, by FSMA, the right to inspect food facilities to determine if they have a right to come to the United States, and has provided better direction and better management of those rights through this guidance, explaining companies what happens if they refuse inspection or if the government refuses inspection. If an FDA scheduled inspection does not happen for any reason, including lack of response to their request of inspection, or simply not allowing them to perform their job in a reasonable way, what will happen is they have created Import Alert 9932, and they will put you on an Import Alert list. And the guidance says that the only way to solve it is a new inspection by FDA, which has to happen, and it will probably happen not earlier than a year. So for a whole year, a company will be maintained on the red list and will be refused, their products will be refused entrance to the United States. So going to our topic, we're going to talk about the challenges of managing a supply chain in these times of supply chain shortages, thinking about first, what is driving the management of a supply chain? In any area that you are, either in manufacturing or retail or food service, your final client, your final purpose is the consumer. So we have to understand the consumer behaviors to make sure that we build our business around those desires and those behaviors, because the consumer is the one that gives you the trust, and but is also very, very critical and not forgiving when you fail to them. So what drives those behaviors? Of course, social media is front and center. Everybody is looking at social media. It's on their phones. So anything that happens, you hear first from social media when you're driving, when you're talking to your friends, when you're just looking at your phone. Mainstream news is another area where the consumer learns behaviors, learns news, and creates new perceptions and new behaviors. Word of mouth, of course, what the own experiences that the consumers have, and the history and support for their brands. Based on this, we bring into the plate the sustainability component, which is driving forces. There's a great concern to manage sustainability, to be conscious of what we're doing to our planet and how we are protecting the resources that we have through an adequate management of the resources. So if you look at the model of sustainability, it starts with your agricultural practice and using sustainable utilization of water or energy, soil management, following by the suppliers with the same criteria, going to production where again always water and energy are driving forces, and of course using sustainable packaging, trying to be a zero waste facility if possible, and having R&D projects that are built based on sustainability. With transportation, we're looking at the same type of resources and guaranteeing product safety in that management and sustainable consumption for consumer satisfaction. Throughout this whole process, from agriculture to the hands of the consumer, we have a food supply chain management that has to be economic, conscious of the environment, and meet social standards. And we have to meet food safety. So we have components of good agricultural practices from the farms and the produce area and the grain growing, to the preventative approach for risk management of food safety from the supplier, production, and transport till it gets to the consumer, and then consumer safety in how the products are managed at the consumer level. Sustainability is a big component that is playing on the challenges of the supply chain. If you look at the 6 steps of the supply chain, it starts with the sourcing of ingredients and raw material, which are then taken to production, processed and packaged, stored. Then there's wholesale distribution and retail redistribution. If any of these components fail, or more than one components fail, we're at that perfect storm where your constraints of the supply chain and the changes that are need to be made to meet those consumer demands that we discussed at the beginning are critical. And we have to find, as responsible for food safety, working with our procurement teams and working with our logistics teams, working together to understand how we manage those, always having front and center maintaining food safety. And that's why we call it the perfect storm. So if you look at the evolution of the supply chain and its complexity, it's not straightforward one step to the other. There's a lot of moving parts in the supply chain. It's not longer limited to the first tier supplier, the manufacturer, and the distributor. Everybody is involved and everybody has more than role within the supply chain. You could be a distributor for wholesales and a distributor for retailers. So communication is a big component because one or more ingredients could be sourced globally, not domestically, and it creates a new complexity with regulatory environments and language barriers. So communication becomes more intricated and requires more attention and requires teams working on how to communicate better. Natural disasters add a component of complexity on top of all these, which you have to manage and you have to react quickly. So the emerging challenges for the supply chain, to add to those that we have discussed, which is the natural change and evolution of the supply chain in a global environment, we have had the COVID-19 pandemic and quarantine requirements, which really reshaped the business models for many, many countries and many commodities. Natural disasters, we hear them more and more and more every year. As part of the changes that were created by the pandemic, there were changes in the workforce, changes in what the workforce is looking for, changes in their different roles. Transportation has also become very challenging because those changes in the workforce, plus we talked a little bit of natural disasters, have challenged transportation. There's not enough truck drivers. There's not enough, sometimes transportation gets interrupted because of changes in climate. So it has become, transportation is a big component of the challenges of the supply chain. The financial and political risks that the world is seeing, inflation all over the world, big inflation in many countries outside the US that have challenged businesses, and many businesses have closed, political risks that have changed regulatory environments as well. Then challenges in demand, because when all these things are happening together, the puzzle to put them together is a lot more difficult. And on top of that, it's a constraint to be able to forecast accurately, because consumers have changed behaviors as well. Their requests are different. So what was good 3 years ago in the sourcing model, and you knew that for Halloween you were going to be consuming X amount of candy, uh, I'm adding this component because with allergen issues emerging more and more and more, there's strategies where, okay, don't give candy, give toys. That changes the forecasting model as well. There's constrained availability, and speaking of what I just shared, rearrangement of consumer habits. And all that has to be considered when you shape your supply chain and you design your supply chain for an ongoing, consistent working sourcing model. With all the changes that have occurred in the supply chain model, the management of the supply chain has also evolved. And companies are not equipped to manage external partners and supplier risk in the same way they manage their own. They don't have the people resources, they don't have the outreach, they don't have the financial capabilities to say, I manage all my suppliers with the same close work model that I have for my own manufacturing sites or my own retail sites. So you have to rely on your suppliers. They have less resources to manage the supplier risk than their internal one. And usually companies monitor what they consider the first and second tier suppliers, which are those suppliers that supply directly key main ingredients for production, that just supply those for them, and the supplying model is less complicated. Suppliers are usually managed through contractual agreements, and there's different business model to manage suppliers through contracts. Some companies just sign a contract that is only covering delivery without establishing other requirements for compliance. Other companies have multiple requirements in that contractual agreement, and that changes the business model. So the same supplier has to abide to different business model, which creates a different complexity as well. Sometimes you have the middle person, the brokers, the agents, which really are the ones that the companies are working with, and they are the ones that talk to the suppliers. So there is that middle person that is, again, driving communication and driving sourcing models. And these constraints in sourcing have required last-minute changes. One of the things that I want to bring up front and center as part of the understanding of risk in these supply chain models is the water. Water has become front and center from the farm to the consumer, and agricultural water has been regulated by FDA because of the risks of contamination that there is with agricultural water, coming from flood water, coming from nearby farms that could have poultries or animal farms that could bring contamination to agricultural products. Then you have the treated water from plants. If you don't know what your suppliers are doing, do you know how they're handling their water from their treatment plants, their own potable water? Is it potable? Is it public? Is it well water? And the most critical ones, with the climate change, there's countries that are becoming water deficient. With that, being water deficient means that they have to ask the whole population, even the farmers and the growers, to change their irrigation habits. And that emergency changing of the irrigation habits can bring unknown risks of using recycled water, of using water from water treatment plants, water that is circulated several times, because they have to be conscious of being water deficient. So it's something that I want to put front and center for all of you, that think of water when you're doing any type of sourcing, but more than anything, when you're doing emergency sourcing, watch the water, ask questions about the water, keep that front and center, because the water could be that hidden risk that you all don't want to have, especially if you're doing emergency sourcing where you're going to be doing this on a faster pace and knowing less from your suppliers. So what are the toolboxes for regular sourcing? Usually databases for ingredient sourcing have become very relevant because they provide information on who are the suppliers, what's the country of origin. They have information. There are several databases and they have information on specifications, country of origin, how many suppliers in different areas, domestic or foreign. So the watch out for this is, what is the vetting process that these databases use to list their suppliers? Don't just rely on them to say, okay, I can bring it because it's on the database, before understanding the vetting process. And if those suppliers are sourced outside the US, where they're bound to different regulatory environments, make sure that you understand the regulations that drive compliance for those ingredients, okay? So when you review those, make sure that you understand what are the standards to manage physical, chemical, and biological risks, and allergen control, and management of sanitizers, so that you understand what risks could be different if they are regulated or not. Then understand in the management of the database, what is the frequency of updates that they do, and what resources do they use to update it. And make sure you have a process of management of change for constraints and sourcing as part of your model, on top of what the ingredient sourcing database might have. So what's again in the toolbox? When you're looking for suppliers, you're going to be looking for certain drivers. The three that I consider a starting point are the history of recalls and regulatory failures. You always have to watch if those suppliers have had recalls. Are they recent? What was the size and the global impacts? Which ingredients were impacted? Is it the ingredient that you're trying to source, or the packaging that you're trying to source? Or is it a different one? Where was this manufactured? So the manufacturing source, and if they provided information when you were approaching them, to bring them as part of your database. And this includes to your existing suppliers as well. Trends of data are very important. So looking at the history of recall as part of your data is always very important. Then looking at GFSI audits, you're always going to look at the trends of critical, major, and minor nonconformities. And my recommendation is always look for 3 or 4 consecutive years of GFSI audits to look at those trends and see if the critical or the major tend to stay on the different areas of assessment or the same ones. Did they all happen with the environmental microbiological monitoring program? Did they all happen with the cleaning and sanitation deviations? Did they happen on incident management? Did they have an allergen issue that it's kind of an allergen failure for risk of cross contact that could be happening every year, for example? And always, if you find these trends, make sure that you track the CAPAs on how they were addressed and resolved to get the certification. And then a lagging indicator that is always very important for the supplier, if they have consumer and customer complaints. If they are selling business to business, probably they're not going to have direct consumer complaints, but they're going to have customer complaints. Don't miss a review of those and look at the trends of those and how they are addressing. If they are food safety deviations, did they trigger any change? Did they address it? Did they resolve it? And review the social media platform to make sure that if there's anything, it was addressed and you have knowledge of it. A tool very important is you can have the best programs in place. The programs are managed and implemented and every day executed by people. So looking at behaviors as part of the tools that you have in your toolbox is always a critical factor to determine the success of the programs. So the role of the leaders is something that you have to watch. Are the leaders involved? Are the leaders recognized? Do they recognize the value of the team? Do they communicate with the team? Do they have cross-functional teams as part of the food safety culture model? How the people are empowered, and what kind of education and training and what kind of recognition is designed for the people to empower and motivate them. If there is a food safety culture, how are they managing it, exporting it, and integrating it? And how are they working with their suppliers to evolve it? Communication is critical, and you can design communication to overcome language barriers. Sometimes communicating internally, it's easy with video tools. Communicating externally, there's many mechanisms that can overcome language, even simultaneous translations, even designing a language and having other teams have a translator. You can always address language barriers and make sure you have the tools to do that. And remember that food safety culture, the management of behaviors, is designed to turn behaviors into habits. So when you look at managing behaviors, turning them into something that the people do without thinking because it's embedded in their minds that it is the right thing to do, the programs become much more effective at the manufacturing, at the retail level, and also at the supplier level. So be exporters of cultures that change behaviors into habits. And keep in mind that the hazard risk is something that is always front and center for any food safety systems. Use the hazard risk and awareness dimension to have tools that track performance and turn that into part of the communication tools that you use for your team. For example, if you're tracking compliance with your environmental microbiological monitoring program and you share the seek and destroy mindset and what you're finding and how you're addressing and what vectoring is done, and you have trends of data that the workforce can see and ask questions about, they become part of the solution. So when you have a supplier approval program, you have a big buckets of areas that you're going to be looking at, and your expectation is going to be that the suppliers are going to be managing their risk, establishing their programs, the practices and drivers of behaviors to control the risks. So you're going to be looking at the hazard analysis, the internal audits, verification of label, inspection and sampling, history of recalls, traceability, allergen management, cleaning and sanitation, and all the others that are listed here. The role that you're going to have with those suppliers is to understand their risks and work with them to establish supplier control. Your supplier control programs have to do with what the supplier is doing. And that matters not only for your new suppliers, but for existing suppliers. And what kind of verification of the effectiveness of their programs you're going to implement in your supplier control programs is going to have to do with understanding all of these little buckets that I have put here, and any other that you would like to add, to determine which ones are the driving forces for you to build your programs. How do you monitor performance in your existing suppliers? You focus on their performance based on the buckets that I shared, and you review how they're performing by developing scorecards on what are critical markers for you, okay? And make sure you do that with your cross-functional teams. You review with them the compliance to the programs, the management of deviations, and corrective actions, and look at their as part of the management of performance. It's always good to look at the internal audits. What trends do they see there? Regulatory audits, what trends do you see there? And how are they managing those? And how are they using that information within their own food safety systems that can help you build your own tracking and scorecards integrated with them? The leading indicators that they're probably going to have well built, or they should, if they are a processing site, like a flour mill or a intermediate ingredient site, for example, that manufactures a prepared mix or a powder for starting a beverage, or other intermediate ingredients that are a composite of several primary ingredients. In those processing sites, you're going to have preventive controls, you're going to have environmental monitoring programs, you're going to have a master sanitation schedule, you're going to have a management of incidents and near misses. And those are trends that you want to see. They're good leading indicators to show you the strength of the food safety program, especially when a company is focused on the near misses. When a company understands that working on those and creating awareness on near misses is one of the most important drivers to look at the strength of your program and continue in that mindset of continuous improvement. And with that mindset of continuous improvement, keep in mind that continuous improvement means trying to be better every day, to be best in class, and be drivers of good food safety programs. And for that, you have to look at, are there any investments needed to maintain food safety at my site? Is the equipment corroded? Is the equipment not designed with a hygienic sanitary design model? Is it difficult to access, to clean, or to disassemble to manage allergens? If I am a retail establishment, do I need to redesign the kitchen so there is segregation between the raw and the cooked? If there is good storage place to separate those, so there's no risk for cross-contamination. If allergens in the kitchen are handled in a way that they're not going to contaminate other foods and carry the allergens for people that don't know that they are there and could get very sick. If there is a program for incentives and recognition for the workforce, having the workforce motivated and empowered. If the workforce is educated to understand the why. If the workforce understands not only the what they have to do, how they have to do it, and when they have to do it, but they understand why they have to do it, they become empowered, they understand their role, and they understand how important it is that they follow the practices that are established in the food safety programs. So we have reviewed together what you usually do for your suppliers. So when you have to do emergency sourcing, the first recommendation I can give you is emergency sourcing is going to happen. So if you look at emergency sourcing like a crisis, you develop a program. You do not improvise or respond to pressure. I mean, it's going to be urgent, yes, but don't try to reinvent the wheel on those very last 5 minutes, because it's already invented. So you're not going to be able to manage it appropriately. Think that if you don't know much about the supplier, make sure you have tighter controls. So let's say, for example, if you usually did not request a testing frequency for that supplier because you had visited them and you had seen all the food safety programs and they were trustworthy and they had great programs and great KPIs to prove that the programs were effective, you were not doing a lot of testing for each lot for any physical, chemical, or biological deviation. But if you don't know this supplier, you're going to want a verification, a tight verification model. Communication is always critical, and it's a driver of success. If you're going to source from a new supplier, start communicating with them and start establishing what is it that you want to know first, okay? Build a contract with them, a contract that has the strength on food safety that you require and that are going to be very important to bring it to your manufacturing or your retail kitchens. Keep traceability, and that traceability starts from the sourcing to the finished product to know when was this new emergency sourced ingredient or packaging source and which lots were impacted. If anything happens and you have to recall that product or you have to withdraw it from the market, it's very good to keep very, very strong traceability so that it doesn't impact other products and you reduce the size of your recall. Communication again. You start communicating from the beginning to the end, and you share with that new supplier not only what is required to bring that ingredient, how you're going to use that ingredient, how is it going while you use that ingredient, and any information that you have from consumer or customer complaints, you continue to communicate with that supplier. and you establish specific KPIs for this activity. So you might want to track even closer certain markers at your facility when you're using these ingredients or during the sourcing process. And if we talk a little bit more about that, when you are ready for the unexpected and you know that it's going to happen, you're going to have a proactive start. So you work with procurement to try to have more than one supplier for each ingredient. Always have more than one, if possible, more than two. Have a backup. If you have a single sourced ingredient, that is a problem. So start working with that proactively so that if that supplier has a problem, you know there is a backup, okay? And part of building that backup is having your procurement team making sure that the supplier carries extra inventory if they need it to source larger quantities, because sometimes having more than one supplier, but you only have small contracts with them and you don't have like a backup plan in your contract or in your relationship with them, might happen that they're still not going to be able to help you. Always be in the starting process for new suppliers, okay? There are many suppliers of similar ingredients in the world. So if you have two, start the process with a third one. And starting the process meaning that you start to request all that information that we have reviewed before and that you need to have some information now. That will help you, will give you a jump start. If you have to source and it is an emergency, you're going to have seen something from that supplier, okay? When you're managing the emergency, you're going to be working with cross-functional teams, procurement, logistics, sometimes product development and R&D, definitely the food safety and quality teams, the plants that need that product. This line, food safety comes first, has to be front and center, sitting on the center of the table so that everybody can see it, okay? It's emergency sourcing, but if it's going to be a product or it's going to be packaging that has direct food contact, food safety comes first. You can always do a quick search for the history of recalls, and you can always communicate and ask them for any regulatory failures. I mean, that can happen, and with the speed of communications, don't consider today's webinar, but with the speed of communications, you can get that information, okay? Incorporate emergency sourcing as part of the crisis manual. I said it before. You put it on your crisis manual. You create a chapter for emergency sourcing of ingredients. You can even create priorities within your ingredients to determine what are the critical factors for each ingredient for emergency sourcing. Have a policy written that people don't need to go to the whole manual when they need to understand where it goes. And in that policy, you have established what needs to happen, who is going to be responsible, who are going to be the stakeholders, and who's going to drive this process, and make it a cross-functional team, and establishing key stakeholders for the process. And make sure that your guardrails are effective, okay? So you're going to enhance your sampling and testing. You're going to request a history of GFSI audits. You're going to review specifications. I already shared, you're going to review recalls. You're going to review any situations where they had a withdrawal. The more you communicate with them, and the more, I mean, these are not the only ones. You can build as many as you want that you can receive while the product is being shipped. And this is the most important thing. Say no if you have to, okay? Nobody has to say yes if there's a risk, because that risk can backfire and be very costly, millions of dollars. So make sure you are aware of those risks. When you have to say no, it's better to say no. There are search engines that you can use for to look for sourcing risks, and I'm sharing some here. I'm sure you have others, and there are some private ones that require sign-up memberships, and but there are many others, so you can be ready and be proactive, and you can even have in your search engines the list of all of the suppliers for the ingredients that you have, the list of 10 suppliers that you could, and put a score of which are the best and which are the less desired, so that you can work with that and have an agile response to emergency sourcing. E-commerce is an area that you have to keep an eye, especially if you're going to be doing emergency sourcing. It's very tempting. But you have to watch temperature management for e-commerce because it's really not thoroughly regulated, so it poses a higher risk. Allergen management is something that you have to consider front and center. If the products that you're sourcing are fully cooked and ready to eat, make sure that you check the practices. Are they ready for the consumer to consume them as is if you source them? Or do they need to have extra heating in the process? Do they need to have some handling to make sure that they're adequate for consumers? Some ingredients, some intermediate ingredients can use ghost kitchens. Be aware of that. Sometimes ghost kitchens are excellent, and others you don't know the practices that they have, and you could have hidden risk, allergens being a very critical one, but also biological risk, practices on cleaning and sanitation. So who owns the process in e-commerce is very important. So make sure you ask all your questions before thinking that this is an easy way out. So as a summary for everything that you said, okay, when you manage change, and emergency sourcing is change, you have to establish your expectations. You have to reward performance. So it is very important that you reward performance. You have to create a relationship with your suppliers and build that relationship and have a network of preferred suppliers. You could, in that communication, you expect consistency from your suppliers and you share that with them, and it could be part of a contract. Okay. You have to be adaptable with them. You have to understand sometimes their sourcing challenges, their shipping challenges, their distribution challenges. So you are adaptable and you expect the same from them to your changes in forecasting, changes in timeline for delivery. You have to manage data and make sure data is manageable. There are a lot of sources to manage data. So make sure you use those effectively to understand and have an agile system to understand and manage data. And I left the most important to the last. We're all people. If we communicate effectively, we are much more successful. When we communicate with people, we build a relationship. We establish certain parameters of trust. And when that relationship evolves, the supplier decides that you are a desired customer to work with them, that understands them, that can listen to them, and that you can offer help to them. You build that trust, you're going to have a much more effective relationship that can help you even with emergency sourcing. So with this, I am going to leave it for questions that I hope you can send on an email, and we'll be happy to respond them. You can send them to SafetyChain, to Jim, and he'll share with you how to communicate with us. It was a pleasure to be with all of you today. Thank you very much.